In the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, where the blue waters meet the endless sky, a monumental clash of titans unfolded. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in World War II and arguably in history, was more than a display of military might. It was a crucible of courage, strategy, and the unyielding spirit of those who fought in the skies and on the seas. This is the story of Lieutenant Michael Mick Sullivan, a young pilot in the U.S. Navy, whose bravery and skill in the cockpit helped shape the course of the battle and, in turn, the war. Join us as we dive into a tale of aerial dogfights, daring maneuvers, and the decisive moments that turned the tide in the Pacific theater. The echoes of Leyte Gulf still resonate as a testament to the resolve of the Allied forces and a pivotal moment that marked the beginning of the end of World War II. In the vast expanse of the Pacific, as the sun began to rise, casting a golden hue over the endless blue, the world stood on the brink of a naval confrontation unlike any other. This was October 1944, and the stage was set for the Battle of Leyte Gulf, a clash that would go down in history as the largest naval battle of World War II. The Pacific Campaign had been raging for years, a brutal contest of wills between the Allied forces and the Empire of Japan. Each island, each atoll claimed, brought the Allies closer to Japan's doorstep. At the heart of this campaign was a promise, a vow made by General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Pacific. "I shall return," he had said, after being forced out of the Philippines by the Japanese in 1942. Now, 2 years later, he was ready to fulfill that promise. The liberation of the Philippines was not just a strategic necessity, it was a personal mission for MacArthur. For the United States, the Philippines held immense strategic importance. Situated in the Southeast Asian archipelago, it was the perfect staging ground for subsequent attacks on Japan. But more than that, it was a symbol of American resolve and a test of their commitment to defeating Imperial Japan. As dawn broke, the silence of the sea was punctuated by the hum of aircraft engines. On the deck of a U.S. Navy aircraft carrier, part of Admiral William F. Halsey Jr.'s mighty Third Fleet, stood Lieutenant Michael Mick Sullivan, a young pilot whose eyes were set on the skies and heart firm with determination. Mick, a small-town boy from the Midwest, had joined the Navy out of a sense of duty and patriotic fervor. He was a skilled pilot, known among his squadron for his quick reflexes and sharp wit. Mick looked out at the sea, thinking about the task ahead. He and his fellow pilots were the spearhead of the U.S. Navy's power in the Pacific. Their aircraft were not just machines of war, they were symbols of hope and carriers of vengeance for the men who had fallen in the earlier years of the war. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in Japan, a different scene was unfolding. The Japanese High Command, aware of the impending American attack, was preparing its own counter-strategy. Operation Shogo was their final desperate attempt to turn the tide of the war in their favor. Admiral Takeo Kurita, a man known for his experience and cautious nature, was given command of the center force, the main fleet that would confront the Americans in the Philippine Sea. Back on the carrier, Mick's thoughts were interrupted by the call to action. It was time. He and his squadron were about to embark on a mission that would not only test their skills and courage, but also shape the course of the war in the Pacific. As his plane catapulted off the deck and soared into the sky, Mick felt a surge of adrenaline. This was more than just another sortie. It was a step towards fulfilling a promise, a step towards victory in the largest ocean of the world. In the grand tapestry of the Pacific War, the Battle of Leyte Gulf was about to be woven as its most defining moment. This battle was not just a test of military might. It was a battle for freedom, a fight for justice, and a quest to reclaim what had been lost. As the sun climbed higher, casting its light over the vast theater of war, The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through the ages. In the chapters to follow, the story of the Battle of Leyte Gulf will unfold, seen through the eyes of those who lived it, fought it, and remembered it. It is a tale of courage, sacrifice, and the unyielding spirit of those who fight for what they believe in. As the early morning light shimmered over the Pacific, the Allies' massive naval force, spearheaded by the U.S. Third Fleet under Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr., was in full preparation mode. The fleet, a formidable array of battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and, most importantly, aircraft carriers, was gearing up for an operation that would be etched in the annals of naval warfare. Lieutenant Michael Mick Sullivan, after his first reconnaissance flight of the day, landed back on the deck of his aircraft carrier. The energy aboard was palpable. Sailors and airmen, aware of the impending battle, worked with a sense of urgency, yet maintained a veneer of calm professionalism. Mick, soaked in sweat after his flight, felt a mix of anticipation and nervousness. He knew that the coming days would test the mettle of every man in the fleet. The carrier, a floating fortress and airbase, was abuzz with activity. Planes were being armed and fueled, pilots briefed, and strategies refined. The aircraft carriers were the crown jewels of the fleet, housing fighter planes, torpedo bombers, and dive bombers, the tools that would provide the Allies with air superiority. Admiral Halsey's plan was clear yet audacious. He intended to use his carriers to their fullest potential, launching airstrikes against the Japanese fleet while protecting the amphibious forces that General MacArthur would lead to the beaches of Leyte. Halsey knew the importance of air power in this battle. The control of the skies could very well dictate the outcome of the entire operation. Mick, alongside his squadron, was briefed on the latest intelligence. The Japanese, desperate to defend the Philippines, were planning a counteroffensive. But the Allied intelligence had intercepted and decoded Japanese messages, giving Halsey and his commanders a significant advantage. Knowledge of the Japanese plans allowed them to position their forces strategically, setting the stage for a preemptive strike. As the day progressed, the sense of impending conflict grew stronger. Mick and his fellow pilots reviewed their flight plans, checked their aircraft, and mentally prepared for the battles ahead. They knew that their success in the air would not only protect their fellow soldiers and sailors, but also pave the way for the liberation of the Philippines. Mick took a moment to write a letter to his family back home. In it, he spoke of his hopes and fears, his commitment to the cause, and his desire to return home safely. As he sealed the envelope, he looked out at the vast expanse of the ocean, where the fate of many, including his own, would soon be decided. As night fell, the fleet maintained a state of readiness. Radar operators vigilantly scanned the screens, and anti-aircraft gunners stood by their weapons. In the darkness, the Allied fleet sailed towards the Philippine Sea, towards a confrontation that would be remembered as one of the greatest naval battles in history. Mick lay in his bunk, trying to catch some sleep before the dawn, but his mind raced with thoughts of the coming battle. He knew that the next day, he and his squadron would be in the thick of the fight, soaring over the Leyte Gulf where history would be made. Across the vast expanse of the Pacific, under the cloak of darkness, the Imperial Japanese Navy, led by Admiral Takeo Kurita, was setting in motion a plan that they hoped would turn the tide of the war in their favor. This plan, known as Operation Shogo, was Japan's response to the impending American invasion of the Philippines. It was a bold, complex strategy designed to engage and destroy the Allied fleet, thereby halting General MacArthur's return to the Philippines. In the command center of his flagship, the mighty battleship Yamato, Admiral Kurita pored over maps and intelligence reports. Kurita, a veteran of naval warfare, understood the gravity of the situation. The Japanese fleet had suffered significant losses in previous engagements, and their resources were dwindling. Operation Shogo was more than a military operation. It was a gamble of the highest stakes. The plan involved multiple Japanese naval forces, including Kurida's center force, which boasted some of Japan's most powerful warships. They were to converge on Leyte Gulf from different directions, in a pincer movement designed to trap and annihilate the Allied fleet. Despite the daring nature of the plan, there was an air of desperation in it. The Japanese knew that failure could mean the end of their naval power in the Pacific. Meanwhile, Mick Sullivan and his fellow Allied pilots were unaware of the exact details of the Japanese plan, but they knew that a formidable force awaited them. The thought of facing the legendary Japanese battleships and cruisers was daunting, yet it steeled their resolve. The pilots were the eyes and ears of the fleet, and their role in the upcoming battle would be crucial. As dawn broke, the Japanese fleet moved stealthily through the Sibuyan Sea, heading towards the San Bernardino Strait. The sea was calm, the skies clear, conditions that were ideal for naval warfare. Kurida's sailors were battle-hardened, but the mood amongst them was tense. They were about to engage in a battle that would determine their nation's fate. On the Yamato, Kurita received a final update on the positions of the Allied fleet. He knew the Americans had superior air power, and his ships would be vulnerable to aerial attacks. But he also believed in the skill and spirit of his men. The Japanese had a saying, kamikaze, which meant divine wind. It referred to a typhoon that had saved Japan from invasion centuries ago. As he gave the order to advance, Kurita hoped for a modern-day kamikaze, a stroke of fortune that would grant them victory against overwhelming odds. The stage was set for a confrontation of epic proportions. Two fleets, representing the might of the United States and the Empire of Japan, were about to clash in the waters of Leyte Gulf. For Mick Sullivan, Admiral Kurita, and thousands of sailors and airmen, the coming hours would be a test of courage, skill, and endurance. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, a pivotal moment in the Pacific War, was about to begin. The first rays of the sun had barely touched the horizon when Lieutenant Michael Mick Sullivan and his squadron were already airborne. Their mission for the day was clear: reconnaissance and, if necessary, the first strike. The vast Pacific Ocean lay beneath them, a deep blue canvas on which the fate of nations would be drawn. Mick's plane, a sleek fighter, cut through the sky with precision. His eyes were constantly scanning the horizon, searching for any sign of the Japanese fleet. The importance of air reconnaissance in naval warfare had grown exponentially throughout the war, and now it was crucial. The first to spot the enemy could dictate the terms of the engagement. As Mick and his squadron patrolled the skies, hundreds of miles away, Admiral Kurita's center force was advancing. Unbeknownst to them, their movement had already been detected by Allied submarines and scout planes. The chess pieces were moving, and the board was set for a grand strategic play. Suddenly, Mick's radio crackled to life. They had a sighting. A Japanese reconnaissance plane had been spotted. It was a small but significant encounter. If the Japanese were scouting, their main force couldn't be far behind. Mick and his wingmen pursued the enemy plane, a game of cat and mouse high above the ocean. Back on the Allied carriers, the news of the sighting caused a flurry of activity. Plans were quickly adjusted, and more aircraft were scrambled. The Allied commanders knew that they needed to keep the pressure on the Japanese, to harry and harass them, preventing them from organizing a cohesive attack. The first skirmish occurred when a group of Allied dive bombers stumbled upon a Japanese cruiser detachment. The bombers, diving from the sky, released their payload. The Japanese, taken by surprise, scrambled to respond. Anti-aircraft guns blazed, tracing arcs of fire in the sky. Mick, arriving with his squadron, provided cover for the bombers, engaging Japanese fighter planes in a high-speed aerial duel. This initial encounter was a harbinger of the larger battle to come. It was a test of nerves and skill, with pilots on both sides pushing themselves and their machines to the limit. For Mick, it was a baptism by fire. He had trained for this, but the reality of combat was intense, visceral. Every maneuver, every decision could mean the difference between life and death. As the day progressed, more skirmishes erupted across the sky and the sea. The Allied forces, using their superior air power, continued to probe and attack the Japanese fleet. The Japanese, meanwhile, fought back fiercely, determined to protect their ships and achieve their objective. By the end of the day, both sides had taken losses. Planes had been shot down and ships damaged. But this was just the beginning. The main battle was yet to come. The Allied fleet, bolstered by the information gathered by their pilots, was preparing for the decisive confrontation. Mick returned to his carrier as the sun set, exhausted but exhilarated. He knew that the coming days would bring even greater challenges. But he also knew that he and his fellow pilots had a crucial role to play. They were the eyes of the fleet, the vanguard of the attack. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was underway, and history was in the making. The morning of October 24th dawned with a tense anticipation over the waters of the Sibuyan Sea. The Allied forces, armed with the intelligence gathered by pilots like Lieutenant Michael Mick Sullivan, were on high alert. The Japanese center force, under the command of Admiral Takeo Kurita, was navigating through the treacherous waters, unaware of the impending aerial onslaught. Mick, along with his squadron, was once again airborne before sunrise. Today's mission was critical: to locate and attack the main body of the Japanese center force. The mood among the pilots was a mix of grim determination and adrenaline-fueled readiness. They knew the stakes were high, and the enemy they were about to face was formidable. As they flew over the Sibuyan Sea, the vast expanse of water seemed eerily calm. But beneath this tranquility, the Japanese fleet was on the move, with the mighty battleship Musashi, sister ship to the Yamato, at its core. The Musashi was one of the largest and most heavily armed battleships ever constructed, a behemoth on the seas. Suddenly, a voice broke through the radio silence. They had spotted the Japanese fleet. The pilots quickly moved into attack formation. Mick felt a surge of focus. This was what they had been preparing for. The first wave of Allied dive bombers swooped down from the sky, targeting the massive Musashi. The Japanese battleship, bristling with anti-aircraft guns, responded with a furious barrage of fire. The sky was filled with the deadly dance of planes weaving through explosions and gunfire. Mick and his fellow fighter pilots provided cover, engaging Japanese Zeros in fierce dogfights. The sky was a chaotic battlefield, with planes darting, diving, and spiraling in a high-stakes battle for control. Below, the Musashi, hit by multiple bombs and torpedoes, was struggling. Despite its formidable armor, the ship was taking significant damage. Its deck was ablaze, smoke billowing into the sky, a testament to the relentless assault from the air. The battle raged on for hours. The Allied pilots, pushing their aircraft to the limits, continued their relentless attacks. Mick, in the thick of the action, exhibited remarkable skill and bravery, downing enemy planes and evading fire. As the sun began to set, the once mighty Musashi, crippled and burning, was listing heavily. The behemoth of the Japanese Navy, thought to be near invincible, had been brought to its knees by the relentless power of Allied air superiority. The Battle of the Sibuyan Sea was a turning point in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The Japanese center force, having lost one of its primary assets, was significantly weakened. The Allied pilots returned to their carriers, exhausted but triumphant. They had faced the enemy in a direct confrontation and emerged victorious. For Mick and his comrades, the day's battle was a stark reminder of the power they wielded from the skies. Their role in the battle had been crucial, a fact that was not lost on any of them. They had seen the enemy, faced death, and had played their part in altering the course of the war. As night fell over the Sibuyan Sea, the Allied forces braced themselves. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was far from over, and more challenges lay ahead. But the events of the day had proven the might of Allied air power and the skill and courage of pilots like Mick Sullivan. The tide of war was turning, and they were at the forefront of that change. The dawn of October 25th broke with an ominous tension in the air. The Allied forces, having dealt a crippling blow to the Musashi the day before, were braced for further confrontation. Unknown to them, a critical phase of the battle was about to unfold off the coast of Samar, where a seemingly mismatched engagement would become one of the most extraordinary chapters of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Lieutenant Michael Mick Sullivan and his squadron were quickly scrambled as reports came in of a new threat. The Japanese center force, under Admiral Takeo Kurita, had unexpectedly re-emerged and was now bearing down on the escort carrier group of the U.S. 7th Fleet, commanded by Admiral Thomas C. Kincaid. This group, known as Taffy 3, was significantly outgunned, consisting mainly of escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts, not the battleships and heavy cruisers one would expect to face a force like Kurita's. As Mick's aircraft soared towards Samar, the situation below was dire. Taffy 3, caught off guard by the sudden appearance of the Japanese fleet, faced overwhelming odds. The small, slow escort carriers and their tin can escorts were no match for Kurita's battleships and heavy cruisers. But what the Americans lacked in firepower, they made up for in sheer tenacity and bravery. The escort carriers began launching whatever aircraft they could, many armed only with depth charges and machine guns, not suitable for engaging heavy warships. Despite this, the pilots, including Mick, dove into the attack with a determination that belied their vulnerability. The sea off Samar turned into a chaotic battleground. The U.S. destroyers and destroyer escorts charged heroically, laying down a smokescreen to protect the carriers and launching torpedoes at the looming Japanese ships. They fought valiantly, trying to buy time and space for their carriers. Above, Mick and his squadron, flying in under-equipped planes, made run after run at the Japanese ships. They strafed the decks of the enemy cruisers and battleships, dodging intense anti-aircraft fire. Every pass, every dive was a risk, but they pressed on, determined to defend the fleet below at all costs. The Japanese, surprised by the ferocity and audacity of the American defense, began to falter. Kurita, expecting an easy victory over a lesser force, found himself embroiled in a fight he had not anticipated. The relentless attacks from the air and the daring maneuvers of the U.S. ships sowed confusion among the Japanese fleet. In a battle that seemed to defy logic, the underdog, Taffy 3, was holding its own against a far superior force. The turning point came when Kurita, unsure of the full extent of the American forces and unnerved by the persistent attacks, made the fateful decision to withdraw. It was a stunning turn of events, a David versus Goliath victory that would resonate through the annals of naval history. As the Japanese fleet retreated, Mick and his fellow pilots returned to their carriers. They were greeted as heroes, having played a pivotal role in one of the most improbable naval victories of the war. The battle off Samar was a testament to the courage and resolve of the Allied sailors and airmen who, against all odds, had turned the tide in a crucial moment of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The day's events had proven that valor and determination could indeed triumph over might. For Mick, the battle was a defining moment in his military career, a stark reminder of the unpredictable nature of war and the indomitable spirit of those who fight it. The Battle of Leyte Gulf continued to rage on, unfolding across multiple fronts. Following the unexpected victory off Samar, the Allied forces were poised to deliver the final blows that would cripple the Japanese Navy. Lieutenant Michael Mick Sullivan, having displayed extraordinary valor in the skies above Samar, prepared for the next critical phase of the battle. In the darkness of the early hours of October 25th, another significant chapter of the battle unfolded at Surigao Strait. Here, the Allied Southern Force, under the command of Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, lay in wait for the Japanese Southern Force led by Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura. Mick, aboard his fighter, provided crucial air cover as the Allied force prepared for what would become one of the last battleship duels in history. The Japanese, attempting to link up with Kurida's force, were unaware of the trap they were sailing into. In a masterful display of naval tactics, Oldendorf executed a classic crossing the T maneuver, positioning his battleships across the T of the Japanese column. As the Japanese fleet entered the strait, they were pummeled from both sides by devastating Allied gunfire and torpedo attacks. Mick and his squadron swooped down on the beleaguered Japanese ships, strafing and dropping bombs. The Japanese force was decimated, with Nishimura's flagship, the Fuso, splitting in two and sinking, along with several other warships. The Surigao Strait became a graveyard for the Japanese Southern Force, marking the end of battleship warfare in the modern age. Simultaneously, far to the north, another critical engagement unfolded at Cape Engano. Here, Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet was lured away by a decoy force of Japanese carriers, commanded by Vice Admiral Yasuburo Ozawa. These carriers, with few aircraft, were meant to draw the Americans away from Leyte Gulf, allowing Kurida's force to attack the invasion fleet. Mick, redirected from Samar to Cape Engano, found himself flying over a different battlefield. The Japanese carriers, vulnerable without substantial air cover, were sitting ducks for the powerful Third Fleet. As the first light of dawn broke, Mick's squadron launched a series of ferocious attacks on the Japanese carriers. The air was thick with anti-aircraft fire, but the pilots pressed on. One by one, the Japanese carriers were hit and set ablaze. The Chitose, Chiyoda, Zuikaku, the last of the Pearl Harbor attack carriers, and the Zuiho were sunk in a decisive victory for the Allies. The engagement at Cape Engano was a masterstroke of deception and counter-deception. While Halsey had been drawn away from Leyte Gulf, his fleet had succeeded in eliminating the Japanese carrier threat, a significant victory for the Allies. As the Battle of Leyte Gulf drew to a close, it was clear that the Japanese Navy had suffered a catastrophic defeat. The Imperial Japanese Navy's ability to conduct large-scale operations was effectively ended, marking a turning point in the Pacific War. For Mick and his fellow pilots, the battle had been a harrowing yet triumphant experience. They had faced the might of the Japanese Navy and emerged victorious. The skies over Leyte Gulf, once filled with the roar of engines and the crack of gunfire, were now quiet. The battle had been won, but at a great cost. The sea below bore witness to the loss of lives and the bravery of those who fought. The Battle of Leyte Gulf would be remembered as one of the greatest naval battles in history, a battle where strategy, skill, and courage triumphed over overwhelming odds. For Mick Sullivan, it was more than a military victory. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. As the sun set over the waters of Leyte Gulf, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, the great Battle of Leyte Gulf drew to a close. The sea, which had been a tumultuous stage for one of the largest naval battles in history, now lay eerily calm, its stillness belying the chaos and violence of the preceding days. Lieutenant Michael Mick Sullivan, sitting on the deck of his aircraft carrier, looked out over the vast expanse of water, his mind replaying the events he had witnessed. The battle had been a defining moment not only in the Pacific War, but in the history of naval warfare. The Japanese Navy, once the formidable adversary in the Pacific, had suffered irrevocable losses, losing several of its finest warships and most of its remaining aircraft carriers. For Mick, the victory at Leyte Gulf was bittersweet. He felt a deep sense of pride in what he and his fellow servicemen had accomplished, but it was tempered by the knowledge of the immense loss of life on both sides. The sea below was a grave for thousands of sailors and airmen who had fought bravely for their countries. The aftermath of the battle also marked a turning point in the war. The decimation of the Japanese fleet at Leyte Gulf effectively ended their ability to wage large-scale naval warfare, paving the way for the Allied forces to advance closer to Japan. It was a critical step towards the eventual end of World War II. For Mick and the other pilots, the battle had been a crucible that tested their skills, courage, and resilience. They had faced some of the most intense aerial combat of the war, supporting naval operations, engaging enemy fighters, and enduring anti-aircraft fire. Their role had been crucial in securing the skies over Leyte Gulf, a factor that significantly contributed to the Allied victory. As he reflected on the battle, Mick thought about the future. The war was still ongoing, and more challenges lay ahead. But Leyte Gulf had proven that the Allied forces were capable of overcoming formidable odds, a realization that gave him hope for the days to come. The Battle of Leyte Gulf would be remembered not just as a military victory, but as a testament to human courage and determination. It highlighted the importance of air power in modern warfare and demonstrated how critical the control of the seas was to the outcome of the war. As night fell, Mick looked up at the stars, thinking about his fallen comrades, both friends and foes, who had become part of the vast, timeless ocean. They had all played their part in a conflict that had changed the world, and their sacrifices would not be forgotten. The story of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, as seen through the eyes of Mick Sullivan and thousands like him, was one of bravery, sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of peace. It was a story that would be passed down through the generations, a reminder of the cost of war and the valor of those who fight it.